The courthouse was not large by city standards, but for the small town it stood in, it was the most imposing building around. Its tall wooden doors, polished to a deep shine, carried the weight of decades of trials, arguments, and verdicts that had shaped lives. On that particular morning, the atmosphere inside was electric. Journalists had crowded the benches, locals had packed the gallery, and even court officials seemed unable to hide their anticipation. Everyone knew the case at hand was unusual, but what they didn't know was that it would become unforgettable. The suspect on trial was a man in his late 30s. He had been charged with a violent crime that shook the town's sense of safety. The evidence against him was thin, mostly circumstantial. There were cigarette ashes at the crime scene, vague witness statements, and a handful of inconsistent details. The defense team was confident, already boasting outside the courtroom that their client would walk free. For weeks, whispers traveled across town, painting the trial as one that would end in disappointment. People were almost resigned to the fact that justice might not be served. And then came the twist that no one saw coming. As the prosecution prepared to bring forward their next witness, murmurs spread across the room. Instead of a hardened detective or a nervous eyewitness, a young woman entered, holding the hand of a tiny boy. He couldn't have been older than 3. The sight alone made the defense attorney smirk, shaking his head in disbelief. A toddler? In a courtroom? Surely this was a desperate act by the prosecution to gather sympathy rather than facts. But the boy wasn't alone. Walking beside him was Max, a large German shepherd, a decorated police dog known in the community for his work in search and rescue. Max was not there for intimidation, he was there for comfort. The judge had granted permission for him to accompany the child, knowing the boy had been traumatized and might not speak without a trusted companion at his side. The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence. Some in the gallery leaned forward, curious. Others exchanged doubtful glances. The defense lawyer, adjusting his tie with a smug grin, whispered to his assistant, "This will last 5 minutes before it's thrown out." Even the judge, though maintaining a calm and professional demeanor, adjusted his glasses with a touch of hesitation. No one had ever seen such a young child take the witness stand in their courtroom before. The boy clutched a small, worn teddy bear in one hand and Max's leash in the other. His hair was slightly messy, his eyes wide with both fear and innocence. He looked around the room, confused by the sea of faces, the elevated judge, the suited lawyers, and the man sitting at the defense table. For a moment, it seemed as though he might cry. The tension grew heavier with each passing second. But then Max sat down beside him, calm and protective. The dog's steady presence seemed to ground the child, who instinctively lowered himself into the witness chair. His little legs dangled far above the floor, swinging nervously. He pressed the teddy bear tightly to his chest, his knuckles white from the grip. Yet, when his eyes met Max's, he took a deep breath and settled. The judge spoke first, his voice unusually soft. "Good morning, young man. Do you know why you're here today?" The boy tilted his head, but didn't answer right away. Instead, he patted Max's head gently. The entire room watched, captivated. The prosecutor, careful not to overwhelm him, leaned forward with a warm smile. "It's okay. You don't have to be scared. Do you remember Max? He's here to help you." The boy nodded, whispering almost too quietly. "Max keeps me safe." For the first time, a ripple of emotion moved through the gallery. People who had come expecting a dry legal battle suddenly found themselves emotionally invested. Here was a child, barely able to form full sentences, yet already carrying the weight of something much larger than himself. The defense lawyer, unable to contain himself, stood and objected. "Your Honor, this is absurd. A 3-year-old cannot provide credible testimony. He doesn't even understand the concept of truth and lies." The judge raised a hand, Sit down, counselor. I'll be the one to determine credibility. For now, the boy will continue. Grumbling, the defense attorney sank back into his chair, though his smugness hadn't entirely vanished. He still believed nothing useful could come from the child's words. The prosecutor continued gently. Do you remember the man we talked about? The one you saw? The boy's eyes flickered toward the defense table. For a brief moment, his small body tensed, and he shrank slightly in his chair. His hand gripped Max's fur tightly, and the dog responded by leaning against him reassuringly. It was then, instead of answering the prosecutor, the child turned his face toward Max and whispered something into the dog's ear. The courtroom strained in silence. People leaned forward, desperate to hear. The prosecutor asked softly, "What did you tell Max, buddy? Can you say it out loud?" The boy hesitated. His lip trembled. Then, in a voice that was clear despite its softness, he said, "The bad man smelled like smoke." Just like when Daddy makes fire? Gasps filled the room. The sound was so collective, so sudden, that the defense attorney nearly dropped his pen. He hadn't expected that. Nobody had. It was a small detail, perhaps meaningless to a casual listener. But everyone who had followed the case closely knew its significance. Cigarette ashes had been found at the crime scene, but the evidence was considered weak because no witness had linked it directly to the suspect. Until now, a 3-year-old, without any coaching or legal jargon, had just made the connection. The judge's eyebrows rose in surprise. The prosecutor froze for a second, stunned by the breakthrough, before quickly regaining composure. "Can you tell Max more about the bad man?" he asked gently, careful not to push too hard. The boy nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the dog. He whispered again, this time louder. He had a scar on his hand. He shouted. "He made me cry." The defense attorney shot out of his chair. "Objection. This is leading the witness. This is unreliable. This is overruled," the judge interrupted firmly. He adjusted his glasses, eyes narrowing at the suspect. Everyone in the courtroom knew the accused bore a distinctive scar across his left hand. The gallery erupted with murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously, realizing they had just witnessed the beginning of something extraordinary. The boy didn't know it, but his innocent observations had just shifted the entire course of the trial. And as he hugged Max tightly, swinging his little legs in rhythm with the dog's steady breathing, the entire courtroom sat stunned. They had come expecting a child's babble. Instead, they had witnessed the moment when innocence spoke louder than any lawyer, louder than any detective, louder than fear itself. What began as a day expected to end in disappointment now promised something very different. The courtroom was utterly still. The boy's soft but chilling words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore. For a long moment, no one spoke. Jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Reporters scribbled furiously. And even the usually unshakable judge leaned back in his chair, as though weighing the gravity of what had just been revealed. At the defense table, the accused shifted in his seat. He tried to maintain his composure, but his jaw tightened, and his hands fidgeted on the table. He had not expected a child, a toddler, no less to provide any detail that could corner him. Yet now, those innocent words about smoke and fire had cracked the facade he had built so carefully. The prosecutor, sensing the weight of the silence, chose his next words carefully. He stepped closer to the boy, but not too close. He knew that overwhelming a child this young would cause him to shut down. Instead, he crouched slightly, his voice gentle, almost like a parent's. "Buddy, you're doing such a good job," he said softly. "Do you remember anything else about that man? You can tell Max if you want." Max is listening. The boy, still clutching his teddy bear, turned his head toward the German shepherd. Max, calm and steady, lay close, His ears perked as though he truly understood every word. The child leaned closer, whispering into the dog's ear again. The movement was so small, so tender, that it made half the courtroom hold their breath. "What did you tell Max?" the prosecutor asked, careful not to push too hard. The boy's voice, though timid, carried clearly enough to echo in the room. He had a scar on his hand. It was scary. Gasps rippled once more through the courtroom. Several jurors instinctively glanced at the defendant, whose scar on his left hand was visible even from across the room. He tried to pull his sleeve down to cover it, but the movement only drew more attention. The defense attorney shot to his feet immediately, his voice booming with desperation. "Objection. Your Honor, this is utterly unreliable. We are allowing a child who can barely form coherent sentences to determine the future of a man's life. This is outrageous." The judge fixed him with a sharp glare. "Counselor, sit down." "But, Your Honor, sit down." The defense attorney clenched his jaw, his face red with frustration, and reluctantly obeyed. But the damage was already done. The jurors had seen the scar, heard the boy's words, and watched the suspect's nervous reaction. No amount of legal jargon could erase the impression that had just been etched into their minds. The prosecutor pressed on, sensing the tide shifting in his favor. "You're very brave," he said to the boy. "Can you tell Max what the man did that made you cry?" The child hesitated, squeezing the teddy bear tighter. His eyes darted nervously toward the defendant. The room collectively leaned forward, waiting. Then, in a small but steady voice, he said, "He yelled. He was loud. He made me hide. I was so scared." The sound of chairs creaking filled the room as people shifted uncomfortably. A few in the gallery wiped at their eyes. It wasn't just the words, it was the way the boy spoke them. With complete innocence. With no agenda. With no understanding of how powerful his testimony truly was. The defense attorney sprang up again, unable to restrain himself. "Your Honor, I must insist that this line of questioning be stopped immediately. The child is being led, and his so-called testimony is emotional manipulation at best. He cannot distinguish between imagination and reality." The judge raised his hand once more, silencing the outburst. His gaze lingered on the child for a moment before turning back to the defense. "The objection is noted. Overruled. The boy will continue." The defense attorney sank back into his seat, muttering under his breath. His confidence, so firm at the start of the trial, was beginning to crumble. Meanwhile, the jury couldn't take their eyes off the boy. His every word, his every gesture, seemed to draw them deeper into the story. Even hardened officers sitting at the back of the courtroom found themselves struck by the raw honesty of it all. The prosecutor gave the boy a warm smile. "You're being very strong today. Thank you for helping Max tell us the truth. Did you see the man do anything else?" The boy frowned, as though trying to remember. His small hand stroked Max's fur, fingers tangling in the thick coat. After a moment, he whispered again to the dog, his lips brushing Max's ear. "What did you say to Max?" the prosecutor asked gently. The boy's eyes shifted once more toward the defendant. Then, in a trembling voice, he said, "That's him. That's the scary man." The words landed like a thunderclap. The gallery erupted in a mix of gasps and hushed voices. The defendant's face turned crimson, his hands tightening into fists on the table. Max let out a single, sharp bark that echoed through the chamber, startling everyone. The boy, instead of recoiling, hugged the dog tighter, finding courage in his presence. The judge's gavel came down hard. "Order. I will have order in this court." But order was the last thing the room could muster. The jurors exchanged wide-eyed looks, their minds reeling. The child had not only described details that matched the suspect, He had identified him directly, without hesitation. The defense attorney scrambled to his feet once more, desperation spilling into his voice. "Your Honor, this cannot stand. A child pointing his finger and calling someone scary does not equal evidence. This is ridiculous." But the damage was already done. The jury had seen the fear in the boy's eyes, the instinctive way he clung to Max, and the unmistakable truth that flowed from his innocent words. The judge banged his gavel again, restoring silence. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something respect, perhaps, or acknowledgement that what had just happened was extraordinary. The boy leaned against Max, exhausted from the effort of speaking. His mother, sitting close by, wiped tears from her cheeks, though she tried to stay composed for her son's sake. The prosecutor chose not to press further. He knew he had already gained more than anyone expected. Instead, he nodded at the boy with genuine gratitude. "Thank you, buddy. You've been very brave today. Max is proud of you." The child smiled faintly, resting his head against the dog's shoulder. He seemed oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. As the session recessed, the courtroom buzzed with restless energy. Reporters dashed out to file breaking stories. Jurors whispered among themselves, their impressions already shifting. Even the bailiffs exchanged uneasy looks. Everyone knew what they had just witnessed was not ordinary testimony. It was something else entirely. A child, too young to understand the full meaning of justice, had spoken a truth so powerful it had cut through every legal defense. And though the trial was far from over, the tide had turned. The silence before the storm had passed. Now, the storm itself was about to begin. The tension inside the courtroom felt unbearable, as though every person present was holding their breath at once. The little boy had already said more than anyone had anticipated, and yet there was a sense that he wasn't done, that his innocent eyes still carried truths too heavy for most adults to utter. Max, the German shepherd at his side, shifted slightly, his ears alert. The child leaned closer to the dog again, as if the animal were the only safe space in a room filled with strangers, authority figures, and the man who haunted his memory. In a small, unsteady voice, he whispered something into Max's ear. The gallery, craning their necks to catch the words, could barely hear. The prosecutor, careful not to rush, crouched slightly and asked with warmth, "What did you just tell Max? Can you say it out loud so we can all hear?" The boy looked at him with wide eyes, hesitated, and swallowed nervously. His lips trembled, but when he spoke, his words were surprisingly clear. "The bad man smelled like smoke, just like when Daddy makes fire." The words pierced the silence like a blade. The gallery erupted instantly with gasps and murmurs. People leaned forward, stunned, realizing the significance. Even those who weren't intimately familiar with the case understood that this small, innocent observation was anything but trivial. The detail connected directly to one of the few pieces of physical evidence: cigarette ashes found at the crime scene. Jurors exchanged shocked glances. Reporters scribbled furiously, already knowing this testimony would dominate tomorrow's headlines. At the defense table, the accused man froze. He tried to mask his reaction, but his jaw clenched and his eyes darted downward. His attorney noticed, panicked, and reached out as though to calm him. But the damage was visible. Jurors had seen the flicker of guilt cross his face. The defense attorney jumped to his feet in a desperate attempt to contain the situation. "Objection," he thundered. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. The child is making vague statements that have no factual value. Every house smells like smoke at some point. This is nothing but coincidence." The judge, calm but stern, leaned forward. "Overruled. The jury will decide how much weight to give the child's words." "Sit down, counselor." The defense attorney reluctantly obeyed, though his face flushed with frustration. His confidence, so strong at the beginning of the trial, now wavered visibly. The prosecutor seized the moment. His voice was still gentle, careful not to scare the boy, but there was unmistakable intensity behind his tone. That was very helpful. Thank you. Can you tell Max more about what you saw? The boy hesitated again, clutching his teddy bear so tightly that it seemed stretched. He turned back to Max, whispering softly, his words audible only because the room was so utterly silent. He had a scar on his hand. It was scary. The words sent another ripple of gasps through the courtroom. Everyone's eyes turned immediately toward the defendant. His left hand, scarred from an old injury, was visible even though he instinctively tried to pull his sleeve down. The movement, clumsy and defensive, only drew more attention. Jurors' eyes narrowed, some even leaning forward to catch a clearer view. The prosecutor didn't need to add anything. The image spoke louder than words. The defense attorney leapt up again, his voice cracking. Objection. This child has clearly been coached. There is no way he can recall such details without being led. The judge, visibly irritated now, banged his gavel. Counselor, I have warned you. Sit down before I hold you in contempt. The defense attorney's shoulders slumped. He sank into his chair, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The jurors, meanwhile, remained fixated on the boy, who seemed oblivious to the tidal wave he had just unleashed. The prosecutor gave the child an encouraging nod. You're very brave. Thank you for sharing that with Max. Did the man say anything to you? The boy's lower lip trembled, and for a moment, it seemed he might cry. His small body shrank into the chair, his legs swinging nervously above the floor. Then Max nudged him gently with his nose, and the boy smiled faintly, reassured. He leaned toward the dog again, whispering so softly it was almost inaudible. He yelled. He scared me. I hid. The prosecutor's throat tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. You hid? Where did you hide, buddy? The boy tilted his head, clearly struggling to articulate. Finally, he whispered again, behind the chair. I saw his hand. Once more, the courtroom stirred uneasily. The child's words painted a vivid image. He hadn't just remembered random details. He was describing a sequence of events, pieces that aligned with the timeline investigators had pieced together. At the defense table, the accused shifted again, his face turning red. He tugged at his collar, clearly uncomfortable under the weight of the boy's testimony and the eyes of everyone in the room. Max let out a low growl, not threatening, but protective. The boy wrapped both arms around the dog's neck, burying his face in the fur. It was clear to everyone watching that the child was terrified, but also determined. The prosecutor straightened slowly. He looked at the jury, then at the judge. He didn't need to emphasize what had just happened. The boy's testimony spoke for itself, carrying more power than any lawyer's carefully constructed argument. Meanwhile, the gallery buzzed with whispers. Did you hear that? One woman muttered. He described the scar. And the smoke, another added. How could he know that? Reporters' pens scratched furiously against paper, their notes filled with the kind of detail that would sell newspapers and flood radio reports by evening. The defense attorney buried his face in his hands for a moment, then tried to regain composure. But he knew what everyone else knew. The trial had just shifted dramatically. The judge, after letting the moment linger, banged his gavel for silence. His voice was measured, but carried a weight that no one missed. This testimony will remain on the record. The jury will decide its credibility. The boy sat back in his chair, his energy spent. He stroked Max's ear absent-mindedly, his teddy bear drooping in his other hand. He seemed unaware of the storm he had unleashed, unaware that his simple, Truthful words had just pierced holes in the defense's strongest arguments. For the jurors, the image would not fade. A child so young, yet so certain, describing smoke, a scar, and fear with clarity that couldn't be ignored. And for the suspect sitting at the defense table, sweat pooling on his brow, it was the beginning of the end. The courtroom had expected gibberish from a toddler. Instead, they had received a devastating truth, delivered with the innocence of a child too young to understand the power of his own voice. The storm had begun, and nothing would be the same again. The courtroom had grown into a living thing, breathing in sync with every word the little boy uttered. The air felt charged, every gaze fixed on the toddler whose testimony had already turned the trial upside down. What should have been a weak and stumbling appearance had instead become the heartbeat of the prosecution's case. The boy, though small and fragile in appearance, sat clutching his teddy bear, as though it were armor. At his side, Max remained steady, the quiet protector whose presence kept fear at bay. Whenever the boy faltered, the dog's calm breathing seemed to guide him back to courage. The prosecutor, sensing the shift in momentum, pressed on. But he knew he had to be careful. Too much pressure might overwhelm the child, and everything gained could be lost. His voice softened, his posture relaxed, as though he were talking to his own child at home. "You're doing such a good job," he said, his smile genuine. "Can you tell Max a little more about the man you saw?" "Just talk to Max, and we'll listen." The boy blinked, glanced at the dog, and nodded. His lips moved against Max's ear again, his words first muffled by fur. But when the prosecutor asked him to repeat it, his voice rang out, small yet steady. "He had a big scar on his hand. He shouted at me. He made me cry." The courtroom erupted. Gasps echoed against the wooden walls. Even the stenographer paused for a fraction of a second, startled by the sharp clarity of the child's words. All eyes turned instantly to the defendant. The scar was undeniable, a jagged line running across his left hand, one he had never attempted to hide before this day. Now, under the gaze of 12 jurors and a frightened child, he tugged his sleeve awkwardly, fumbling to cover it. The movement betrayed him more than the scar itself. The defense attorney shot to his feet, his voice cracking. "Objection! Your Honor, this is outrageous. This is hearsay from a child who cannot comprehend the gravity of these proceedings." The judge's gavel struck down with authority. "Overruled. Counselor, I remind you again, the jury will weigh credibility." "Sit down." The defense attorney's face flushed crimson. His hands trembled slightly as he sat, glaring daggers at the prosecutor. But his anger could not erase what had just been spoken. The prosecutor turned back to the boy. "You're very brave. Thank you for telling Max that. Can you tell him what the man did with his hand?" The boy frowned, his brow furrowed as if searching through scattered memories. He pressed his face into Max's neck, inhaling the comforting scent of the dog, and whispered again. The prosecutor leaned closer, his expression patient. "What did he say?" The prosecutor asked gently. The child lifted his head and repeated. He waved it. Like this, he raised his own small hand in a jerky motion. And then he yelled. He scared me. The demonstration, so simple and childlike, carried a force that struck every adult in the room. It wasn't a rehearsed story. It was memory. Raw, unfiltered, and untainted by legal coaching. A murmur rippled across the gallery. Jurors leaned forward, watching both the boy's gesture and the defendant's stiff reaction. The image of a man with a scarred hand yelling at a child was now painted vividly in their minds. The defense attorney, desperate, leapt up again. "This is emotional manipulation. A child cannot testify like this. We demand this testimony be stricken from the record." But the judge's patience had run thin. "Counselor, sit down." One more outburst and I will hold you in contempt. Do you understand? The defense attorney's lips pressed into a thin line. He sat heavily, defeated for the moment. The boy, oblivious to the chaos his words had caused among adults, reached down and scratched Max's ear. The German shepherd responded with a soft thump of his tail against the wooden floor, as though affirming the boy's bravery. The prosecutor, careful not to push too far, asked one last question. "Buddy, can you tell Max what you did when the man yelled?" The child's voice wavered, but he answered, I hid behind the chair. I didn't want him to find me." The gallery stirred again. The jurors' faces reflected a mix of empathy and unease. They could almost see the scene. A terrified child crouched behind furniture, peeking out to see the scarred hand of a man who shouldn't have been there. The prosecutor gave a small nod. "Thank you. That was very brave. Max is proud of you. And so are we." The boy smiled faintly, his body relaxing slightly for the first time since he'd entered the room. He leaned against Max, his eyelids fluttering as though the effort of speaking had drained him. The judge took in the scene, his expression stern but softened by the weight of what he had just witnessed. "The testimony stands," he declared. "The jury will consider it with all other evidence." The defense attorney clenched his fists under the table, his mind racing. He had counted on discrediting adult witnesses, attacking inconsistencies, dismantling forensic evidence. But a child's words, delivered with such unshakable innocence, were a weapon he couldn't fight with the usual tools. In the gallery, reporters whispered urgently to one another. The story had transformed before their eyes. What was supposed to be a hopeless trial for the prosecution had become a dramatic spectacle led by a toddler's unfiltered truth. Headlines were already forming in their minds. "Child witness stuns courtroom," or "3-year-old brings trial to a halt." Even the jurors, though instructed not to show emotion, couldn't help the looks they exchanged. Their notes grew frantic, their pens scratching as they recorded every word. The boy's testimony had not only described the man, it had painted him vividly, scar and all. As the recess bell rang, and the judge called for a short break, the courtroom exploded into noise. Reporters hurried out, lawyers gathered papers with trembling hands, and spectators buzzed with gossip. The boy, unaware of the chaos he had caused, yawned softly and clung to Max. His mother approached quickly, scooping him into her arms. She kissed the top of his head, whispering, "You did so good, baby." So good. The boy only smiled sleepily, reaching down to pat Max one last time before resting his head against his mother's shoulder. Across the room, the defendant sat rigid, his face pale, his eyes narrowed with fury. He muttered something under his breath, too low for anyone to hear. But the jurors noticed his demeanor, the cracking facade, the slip of control. And as they filed out for the break, many already carried with them the image of a scarred hand, cigarette smoke, and a terrified child's voice declaring the truth. The trial was no longer about technicalities, evidence, or legal maneuvering. It had become about innocence versus guilt, honesty versus deceit. And the child's innocence was winning. The courtroom was supposed to be a place of order, a realm where words carried weight and law reigned supreme. But on that day, it felt more like a stage where truth and deception collided with every breath. The little boy, still nestled close to Max, had already shaken the foundations of the defense with his quiet testimony. Yet the most devastating blow was still to come. When the court reconvened after recess, the atmosphere was electric. Spectators hurried back to their benches, eager not to miss a single moment. Reporters readied their pens, and jurors returned with tense faces, still haunted by the image of a scarred hand described by a 3-year-old. The prosecutor stood with a newfound confidence. His case, once fragile, had grown solid through the boy's words. He knew the next step, could either cement their victory or risk overwhelming the child. He had to tread carefully. The judge, his gavel tapping lightly for silence, turned to the prosecutor. "You may proceed." The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice calm. "Son, you've been so brave." "Thank you again. I only have a couple more questions." "Just talk to Max, like before." The boy nodded, hugging his teddy bear tighter. His wide eyes darted toward the benches, then back to Max. The dog, sensing his unease, shifted closer, his warm fur brushing against the boy's leg. The steady thump of Max's tail seemed to reassure him. The prosecutor crouched slightly, making himself less intimidating. "Can you tell Max is the man who scared you in this room?" The boy froze, his small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The room collectively held its breath, waiting. Then, slowly, his eyes traveled across the courtroom. He hesitated at first, his gaze flitting between faces, lawyers, jurors, the judge. And then, as though drawn by something unshakable, his eyes locked on the defendant. The boy's lips trembled. He leaned closer to Max and whispered into the dog's ear. At first, only Max heard it. But then, the boy lifted his tiny hand, extended one trembling finger, and pointed directly at the man in the defendant's chair. "That's him, Max," he said, his voice breaking but audible enough for every soul in the courtroom to hear. "That's the scary man." The room exploded. Gasps echoed from the gallery, a collective shockwave rolling through the crowd. Jurors' eyes widened. Some leaned forward, their pens frozen in midair. Reporters scribbled furiously, their hearts racing at the headline they had just been handed. The prosecutor's chest swelled with relief, but he forced himself to remain composed. "Thank you, buddy," he said softly. "You've been so brave." The judge's gavel slammed down, calling for order. Silence in the court. But order was difficult to restore. The child's words were simple, almost innocent in their phrasing, yet they carried the force of a hammer striking stone. The defendant, who until then had maintained an arrogant calm, suddenly shifted in his chair. His hands twitched against the table, his shoulders stiffened, and his face flushed crimson. His attempt to remain stoic faltered. The child's direct accusation had pierced through his defenses like a blade. Max barked, a single sharp bark that echoed in the hushed courtroom. It wasn't aggressive, but it startled everyone. It felt symbolic, as though the loyal dog himself had affirmed the boy's words. The defense attorney shot up instantly. "Objection. Objection, Your Honor. This is outrageous. A child of 3 cannot possibly." "Sit down," the judge snapped, his tone harsher than before. "The objection is noted and overruled. The jury will decide the weight of this testimony." The defense attorney's face drained of color. His strategy was unraveling. He glanced at his client, whose rigid posture betrayed panic. The scarred hand twitched on the table, fingers tapping rapidly, as though desperate to release the pressure building inside. The jurors noticed. Every nervous movement, every flicker of emotion, became evidence in their eyes. The prosecutor pressed forward. "Son, thank you. You've been so brave today. You can rest now." The boy buried his face in Max's fur, his part done. He had spoken his truth in the only way he knew how, with raw honesty. The tension in the courtroom shifted like a tide. For the first time, the defense's confidence was crumbling. The defendant avoided eye contact with the jurors, his jaw clenched tightly, sweat forming at his temples. One juror whispered to another, unable to mask the disbelief etched across their face. Another scribbled a note. He pointed right at him. It wasn't just testimony anymore. It was a memory made real before their eyes. The defendant's mask continued to slip. His lips moved in silent curses, his leg bouncing beneath the table. His attorney whispered urgently to him, but he barely seemed to hear. Then came Max again. The dog stood suddenly, his ears pricked, eyes locked on the defendant. It wasn't aggression, it was instinct. Max had sensed the tension, the rising hostility emanating from the man in the chair. The bark that followed was louder this time, echoing against the wooden walls. The boy, startled at first, then tightened his grip on Max's fur. "It's okay," he whispered to the dog. But for the jurors, the moment was unforgettable. The loyal dog barking as if pointing out guilt itself. The prosecutor let the silence hang, letting the image burn itself into the minds of everyone present. He knew he didn't need to push further. The child had done more in a few minutes than hours of testimony could accomplish. The judge finally called another recess, his gavel striking hard. "This court will reconvene in 20 minutes. As people filed out, the gallery buzzed like a hive. Reporters nearly tripped over one another, rushing to the phones outside. Spectators whispered furiously, "Did you see how he pointed?" The dog barked at him. He looked guilty as sin. The jurors filed out slowly, their faces grim and thoughtful. They weren't supposed to speak, but their body language betrayed the weight of what they had just seen. At the defense table, the attorney leaned in close, hissing at his client. "You need to hold it together. They're watching you fall apart." But the defendant couldn't control himself anymore. His breathing was shallow, his fingers clawed at the table, and his eyes darted around the room like a cornered animal. The child's words had cracked something inside him that could not be repaired. In the quiet of the emptying courtroom, Max sat proudly beside the boy, his tail wagging slowly. The child whispered to his mother, "Did I do good?" She kissed his forehead, her eyes brimming with tears. "You did more than good, sweetheart. You were brave. You helped everyone see the truth." And though the boy didn't fully understand the weight of his actions, the courtroom did. The tide had turned irreversibly. The suspect had come into that trial expecting loopholes, technicalities, and clever defenses to shield him. But he had never expected to be undone by the unshakable honesty of a 3-year-old and the bark of a loyal dog. The walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on him now, each eye burning with judgment. His composure was gone, his arrogance stripped away, and with every twitch of his scarred hand, with every bead of sweat, he dug himself deeper into a pit from which there was no escape. For the jurors, for the public, and for the law itself, the child's words had become a beacon of undeniable truth. And for the defendant, that truth was unbearable. The courtroom was still buzzing when the recess ended. Though the gavel eventually restored order, the electricity in the air refused to fade. Every person seated in that chamber knew they had witnessed something extraordinary. A toddler, barely 3 years old, had pointed directly at the man on trial and called him the scary man. No expert, no seasoned detective, no lawyer could have matched the raw power of that single moment. Yet trials were not decided by emotions alone. The defense attorney knew this better than anyone. His client sat beside him, visibly shaken, his scarred hand twitching as if the very air burned against his skin. The attorney's career, maybe even his reputation, now hinged on dismantling the credibility of a child. It was a desperate move, but desperation was all he had left. When the judge allowed the proceedings to continue, the defense attorney rose, straightening his suit jacket, his face composed but pale. He approached the witness stand slowly, like a predator circling prey, though even he knew the optics were dangerous. To be seen attacking a toddler could backfire catastrophically in front of a jury. Still, he had no choice. "Good afternoon," he said, forcing a smile. His voice was smoother than before, though it carried a false warmth. "You've been very brave today." The boy clutched his teddy bear tighter, his eyes flicking toward Max. The German shepherd remained by his side, calm and unmoving, his steady gaze fixed on the attorney. It was as though Max knew the danger wasn't physical, but psychological. The defense attorney crouched slightly, his tone patronizing. "You like stories, don't you? Sometimes when we dream or pretend, we imagine things that aren't real. Isn't that right?" The boy blinked, then looked at Max as though searching for reassurance. He whispered to the dog first, then spoke softly. "I don't pretend about the scary man." The attorney's smile faltered, but he pressed on. Of course. But sometimes grown-ups ask little kids questions, and they say things just to make the grown-ups happy. Do you remember anyone telling you what to say today?" The boy tilted his head, his brow furrowed. He hugged Max around the neck and whispered into the dog's ear before answering aloud. "No, Max told me to be brave. Mommy said to tell the truth." A murmur swept through the gallery. The jurors' expressions hardened, clearly unimpressed by the attorney's attempt. His line of questioning felt manipulative, and the boy's innocence cut through it with disarming clarity. The defense attorney's jaw tightened. "But you're very small, aren't you? Sometimes little boys get confused. Could it be you saw someone else? Maybe you thought it was this scary man, but it was really another man?" The boy shook his head firmly. His small voice carried a surprising weight. No, it was him. He had the hand. Gasps fluttered across the courtroom. The boy's certainty was unshakable, his words piercing through the defense's carefully crafted doubts. The defense attorney straightened, flustered. His pen tapped nervously against his notepad as he scrambled for another angle. "Children," he said, turning to the jury now, "are imaginative. They see monsters and shadows and villains in their dreams. Should justice hinge on bedtime stories?" The prosecutor leapt to his feet. "Objection. Counsel is testifying instead of questioning the witness." "Sustained," the judge barked. "Mr. Keller, confine yourself to questions." The defense attorney swallowed hard, his control slipping. He turned back to the boy. "When you talked about the scary man, you told the dog first. Why? Why not tell us directly?" The boy hesitated, then pressed his face against Max's fur. His answer was muffled at first, but then he lifted his head, eyes wide and honest. "Because Max listens." Grown-ups don't always listen. The words landed like a hammer. Even the judge blinked, visibly moved. Reporters scribbled furiously, already imagining the headlines. "Child testifies grown-ups don't listen." The defense attorney's strategy was unraveling before him. Every question meant to weaken the boy only made him appear stronger, braver, more genuine. Jurors stole glances at one another, their expressions telling. They weren't just hearing testimony. They were witnessing courage wrapped in innocence. The defense attorney sighed, his shoulders sagging. He had no choice but to retreat. "No further questions," he muttered, his voice hollow. The boy leaned into Max, his small hand resting on the dog's head. For the first time since he entered the courtroom, his lips curved into a faint smile. He had faced the storm and emerged untouched. The prosecutor rose again, offering a reassuring smile. "Just one more, Your Honor." He turned to the boy. "You did amazing. Can you tell Max why you wanted to be brave today?" The boy thought for a moment. Then, hugging Max tightly, he whispered, "Because I don't want the scary man to hurt anyone else." The prosecutor nodded, visibly moved. "That's all, Your Honor." The judge's gavel struck once. "The witness is excused." The boy's mother rushed forward, scooping him into her arms. She kissed his cheek repeatedly, whispering words only he could hear. Max followed close behind, his tail wagging gently, his eyes alert as always. Together, they left the stand not as victims, but as unexpected heroes. The courtroom, though silent, thrummed with unspoken emotion. Jurors scribbled their final notes, their decision already etched in their hearts. The boy had not just testified. He had embodied truth in its purest form. At the defense table, the suspect's mask cracked further. His jaw clenched, his breathing shallow, his scarred hand hidden beneath the table. He avoided the jurors' eyes, knowing they had seen too much already. The prosecutor returned to his seat, his confidence solid. He no longer had to rely solely on evidence or expert testimony. The child had given them something far more powerful, unshakable certainty. For the gallery, the lesson was unforgettable. Strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it came in the form of a trembling child who spoke only because a loyal dog gave him courage. And as the day closed, one thing became clear. The case was no longer about technicalities or doubt. It was about a 3-year-old's truth standing taller than a grown man's lies. The defense had tried to tear that truth apart. Instead, it had only made it stronger. The courtroom hummed with tension as proceedings resumed after the boy's testimony. It was as though the air itself had thickened, every breath measured, every movement under scrutiny. Jurors shifted in their seats, their eyes still haunted by the image of a small child, no more than 3, pointing directly at the man now sitting defensively at the defendant's table. The prosecution began calling additional witnesses. Each one had their own part to play, but the boy's testimony had set the tone. Honesty, precision, and unfiltered observation. It was no longer a matter of evidence alone. It was a story unfolding in front of them, and the narrative was devastatingly clear. Detectives took the stand, recounting details that, until now, had been abstract numbers in reports. They described the discovery of cigarette ashes at the crime scene, their type matching the brand the suspect was known to smoke. Every mention of smoke drew quick glances toward the boy, and jurors connected the dots. He had described the smell of smoke, simple as it sounded, yet perfectly accurate. Next came a forensic analyst, presenting photos of the defendant's scarred hand. The images were magnified, the jagged line prominent, every detail meticulously documented. When the analyst mentioned that the scar could have been a distinguishing feature for someone observing the man closely, the jurors exchanged meaningful glances. They had seen it with their own eyes, witnessed the boy point directly at it. The defense attorney tried to interject at every turn, challenging the credibility of the witnesses, questioning methods, and citing technicalities. But the more he spoke, the more transparent his desperation became. He was fighting a wave he could not hold back, the child's observations having transformed into a tidal force that no lawyer could resist. The boy watched quietly from the gallery. He sat on his mother's lap, Max lying faithfully beside him, his head resting on the floor. Though the child didn't fully understand the gravity of what was happening, he could sense the room's tension and the impact his words had already made. Every nod from a juror, every murmur of acknowledgement gave him a subtle affirmation. He had done something important. The prosecutor approached the witness stand again, calling a neighbor who had observed the suspect's actions on the day of the incident. She described a man who had been unusually agitated, pacing with hands clenched, shouting at someone unseen. Her testimony aligned perfectly with the boy's recollections. When asked if the man had a scar on his hand, she hesitated only a moment before replying, "Yes, a long one, right across the back of his hand. I noticed it because it looked unusual." The juror's pen scribbled furiously. The connections were undeniable. Smoke, a scar, aggression all matched the child's precise observations. The defense attorney tried to regain control. Objection. This is circumstantial. A neighbor could be mistaken. The judge overruled him once more. The jury will weigh credibility. Sit down. Even as the attorney slumped back, the defendant's face betrayed panic. He fidgeted, hands clasping and unclasping, his eyes darting toward the boy. The connection was now unavoidable. Every detail pointed toward his guilt, each corroborated by independent witnesses. Then came the final piece, a behavioral psychologist specializing in child testimony. She explained, in clear terms, how young children can often perceive details with astonishing clarity, even when adults overlook them. She affirmed that, in controlled environments, children's recall can be highly reliable. Her analysis reinforced the weight of the boy's observations and gestures. The courtroom grew silent as she concluded. Based on my assessment, the child's testimony aligns with known facts and observable behaviors. It is credible, accurate, and untainted by adult suggestion. A murmur of disbelief spread across the gallery. The defense attorney's shoulders slumped further. His hands fumbled for papers, as if grasping at any last shred of hope. Max shifted subtly, sensing the rising tension at the defense table. The dog's calm presence radiated reassurance toward the boy, reinforcing his courage. The toddler hugged the dog instinctively, seeking strength in his loyal companion. The prosecution rested their case with a quiet confidence. They had relied not just on physical evidence or forensic reports, but on the extraordinary courage of a small child whose observations had held steady under pressure. Every witness had only reinforced what the boy had already articulated with innocence and clarity. When the defense attorney began his closing argument, his voice was strained. He attempted to emphasize uncertainty, to portray the boy's testimony as flawed, imaginative, or influenced. But jurors, their minds already forming a coherent narrative, seemed unmoved. The child's courage had built a framework of truth too strong to shake with mere words. He gestured toward the defendant, who remained rigid, his scarred hand hidden beneath the table, fingers tapping nervously. "Ladies and gentlemen," the attorney said, "we are asked to make decisions based on the words of a child who may not understand fully what he has seen." A juror whispered to another, shaking her head subtly. But he did understand. The gallery held its collective breath as the defendant finally spoke, voice trembling despite his efforts at control. I didn't." His protest was cut short by Max's low, steady growl. It was a subtle sound, almost inaudible, but the room sensed it. Instinctive judgment, protective loyalty, a reminder that truth could not be denied. The boy's eyes met Max's, and in that small exchange, everyone felt the unspoken truth. The child's courage was absolute. The prosecutor stood for the final time, his voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have seen, heard, and observed. You have seen a child, uncoached, unafraid, recount details that align perfectly with the evidence. You have seen the truth stand firm against manipulation, deception, and fear. It is now yours to recognize and honor." As the court recessed for the day, the weight of what had occurred settled over everyone. Reporters rushed to capture every moment. Jurors whispered, visibly shaken, as they filed out of the room. The gallery buzzed with awe at the extraordinary bravery of a child who had refused to be intimidated, even in the presence of adults and authority figures. The defendant slumped in his chair, exhaustion and panic etched across his face. His attorney leaned over, whispering advice, but the man barely listened. The boy's testimony had dismantled his defenses entirely. Every lie, every attempt at distraction, every technicality now seemed futile. In the quiet of the emptying courtroom, Max nudged the boy gently, and the toddler hugged the dog tightly. Neither fully understood the gravity of the trial, but both knew they had faced something important. Courage, even in the smallest form, had shifted the balance of justice. The storm that had begun weeks earlier, a storm of deception, fear, and uncertainty, had been met by a force almost unimaginable. Innocence unshaken, truth unwavering, and loyalty embodied in the presence of a German shepherd. And as the court prepared for deliberations, everyone understood one undeniable fact. The case had been transformed by the smallest voice in the room. The courtroom was tense, a silent storm before the final verdict. The weeks of testimony, evidence, and dramatic confrontations had brought everyone to this single, decisive moment. Every juror sat upright, pens and notes set aside, faces taut with concentration. Even the air seemed heavier, as though anticipating the culmination of a case that had defied expectations at every turn. The boy perched quietly on his mother's lap, hugged Max tightly. The dog's fur was warm beneath his small hands, and the steady thump of his tail brought a subtle rhythm to the chaos surrounding them. The toddler's bright eyes, wide with innocence, reflected the gravity of the moment, even if he didn't fully comprehend it. The defendant sat rigid at the defense table. His scarred hand rested nervously on his lap, fingers twitching as though betraying the panic within. He had spent the entire trial attempting to maintain composure, yet each piece of testimony, from detectives to neighbors, forensic analysts, and finally, the child had chipped away at his facade. Now, the weight of inevitability seemed to press against his shoulders. The judge adjusted his glasses, clearing his throat. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice measured but carrying authority, "you have seen the witnesses, heard the testimony, and reviewed the evidence. It is now your duty to deliberate and render a verdict based on the facts and your judgment." The jury filed out solemnly, their expressions unreadable, leaving the courtroom in a tense, almost reverent silence. The spectators shifted uneasily, whispering quietly among themselves. Even the reporters paused, sensing that the next moments would define the story forever. The boy leaned closer to Max, hugging the dog's neck as though seeking courage in the warmth of a loyal friend. He whispered softly, words only Max could hear, "Do you think they'll believe me?" Max rested his head against the boy's chest, as though reassuring him. And in that small, unspoken exchange, the toddler drew the strength he would need to face the final chapter. Hours passed as the jury deliberated, and the courtroom slowly emptied, leaving only essential personnel. The boy's mother stroked his hair, whispering gentle words of encouragement. "You've done everything you could, sweetheart. Just be proud." At last, the jurors returned, their expressions somber but resolute. Each one took their seat, and the foreperson rose, holding a piece of paper tightly in both hands. The room fell into a heavy silence, anticipation hanging like a thick fog. "Have you reached a verdict?" the judge asked. "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson replied. Every word seemed measured, deliberate. The judge nodded, his gavel poised but unmoving. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson took a deep breath, and with clarity that echoed through the silent room, began. "In the case of the people versus the defendant, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." A wave of gasps, whispers, and subdued murmurs swept through the courtroom. Relief, shock, and the gravity of justice rendered converged in the air. The defendant's face turned ashen, his eyes wide in disbelief. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of his actions had physically descended upon him. The boy looked up at Max, a faint smile forming on his lips. He had been too small to imagine the scale of what he had accomplished, but he sensed it in the reactions around him. The dog nudged his leg with a gentle paw, sharing in the quiet triumph. The judge's voice broke the moment with authority. "This court acknowledges the bravery of all witnesses, especially the youngest among them. Today, justice has been served not only through facts and evidence, but through the courage of truth itself." Court is adjourned. Applause erupted, though restrained by decorum, as the spectators recognized the extraordinary nature of the case. People rose to their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes, moved not just by the verdict, but by the bravery of a child who had faced fear with unflinching honesty. The defendant was taken into custody immediately. His attempts to appear invulnerable had failed utterly. Every lie, every intimidation tactic, and every attempt to manipulate had been dismantled by the most unlikely of witnesses. A 3-year-old boy, and his steadfast companion, Max. The boy's mother hugged him tightly, tears rolling down her cheeks. "You were amazing, my little hero," she whispered. The boy hugged Max again, murmuring, "We did it. Max, we made the scary man go away." Max licked the boy's face gently, tail thumping against the floor. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried profound weight, a quiet acknowledgement of courage, loyalty, and victory. Reporters clamored outside the courthouse doors, eager to capture the story. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and yet the boy remained calm in his mother's arms. He had achieved something monumental without understanding its full scale. He had spoken truth when no one else dared, and in doing so, he had safeguarded innocence, upheld justice, and inspired everyone who witnessed it. In the following days, the story dominated headlines. 3-year-old brings scary man to justice. Child's courage and loyal dog change a trial. Innocence wins in courtroom drama. Yet beyond the sensationalism, there was a deeper truth, the power of honesty, the impact of observation, and the extraordinary ways even the smallest voice can affect monumental change. For the boy and Max, life slowly returned to normal. The child continued to play, to laugh, to explore the world with unshakable curiosity. Yet he carried with him a quiet understanding. Courage came in many forms, and even a small voice could hold more power than anyone imagined. The courtroom, now empty, stood as a silent monument to that day. Wood polished from generations of cases, walls lined with portraits of past judges and lawyers, all bore witness to an unprecedented moment where innocence met justice head-on. And for the jurors who had witnessed it, the memory remained indelible. A tiny boy, hugging a German shepherd, pointing to the truth with unwavering certainty, and changing the outcome of a trial forever. The defendant's fate was sealed, the truth prevailed, and a remarkable story of courage, loyalty, and justice entered history. In the quiet aftermath, the boy whispered to Max once more, "We helped everyone, didn't we?" Max thumped his tail softly, resting his head against the boy's chest, as if to say, "Yes, we did. And we always will." In that simple moment, the courtroom drama concluded, not with grand speeches or legal jargon, but with innocence, loyalty, and the undeniable triumph of truth. And the world, having witnessed it, could never forget.